I'm delighted to be with you today to talk about Professor Robin Dunbar's book, How Religion Evolved and Why It Endures. This is a wonderful, readable and engaging book, and I should note that Robin was at a certain point a full-time science journalist. Now, it's also a book that covers a wide range of domains, from cultural evolution, archaeology to brain science, though its main focus is, of course, on how religious rituals and ideas have come to be and the role they play at individual and social levels. Thank you so much for doing this, Robin.
Great pleasure to be here.
Great. It's wonderful to see you. I'm sure you're keeping busy. So my first question, and this is coming from an experimental psychologist who studies religion. I mean, personally, one of the most striking things for me in this book is your grasp on the history of religion, particularly Christianity, but not only. So you find across the book various examples and citations, both from marginal religious groups to some of the great Christian mystics and even of theologians like Ronald Knox. So I'd like to ask you to start by telling us when and where did this interest in religious history and ideas arise? Because it's not common to find a psychologist and primatologist who knows so much about the history of religion.
I guess that's because of my checkered career, both my checkered history, personal history, but also my checkered academic career. Marrying into that. So I guess this kind of interest in religion in general really goes back to my childhood, because I grew up in East Africa, and growing up in those days in the 1950s, you were really embedded very deeply in the local cultures. So I'm bilingual in Swahili as a result of that. My father was bilingual in Hindi, from having had the same experience growing up, being born and growing up in India. So we mix in great depth, really, with a whole variety of Indian cultures through my father. So, I knew the difference from a very early age between Islam, various branches of, the Parsis, the Sikhs, you name it, but also the African cultures, which is of course why I speak Swahili. Literally learnt round the campfire from playing with the servants' children in particular in that case. But that any part of Africa is a huge variety of different tribal groups with different tribal religions. So I was exposed to all these different kinds of tribal religions through a very early age, as well as some of the big world religions, particularly from the subcontinent of India. But set that into the background of the fact that my grandparents were missionaries, Presbyterian missionaries. And then I was sent to school, boarding school, at a Catholic prep school in Africa, East Africa. So I grew up exposed to all these kinds of religions. And then I became very enamored in my teenage years, partly through the influence of my cousin on Eastern religions, particularly Buddhism and the yogic tradition in Indian Hinduism and so on. So I had all these very, very early exposures and was just, they were just part of the rich tapestry of life, really. They weren't anything in particular to me. But I kind of learned to navigate the differences through these different kinds of religious perspectives. And I guess then I had always been, that inevitably made me kind of interested in different cultures, both in terms of Africa and in terms of Asia. And for a long that was one of my persisting interests. At school, as a teenager at school, I wasn't studying that, but I read a great deal about anthropology and got very interested in anthropology. But I went off in the end to do study of philosophy, which when I was getting on to university age was the thing I got really interested in. But as it happened, because I went to Oxford rather than anywhere else, I couldn't do philosophy on its own because you couldn't then, and I don't think you can now. You have to do it as something else. And I chose psychology as the least bad option. And I muse to this day that had I gone anywhere else, all my other applications for university were for pure philosophy. And I would now be a very bad second-hand car salesman in some small seaside town. Because clearly I discovered very quickly as an undergraduate, you needed a brain the size of a planet to really survive and succeed in philosophy. So I got seduced away by psychology, I guess is what happened. And then through my PhD, although that was in a psychology department, I did it in a group of zoologists. I was the only psychologist in a very large group of postdocs and PhD students studying largely animal behavior. So I went off and became an ecologist, essentially, and a behavioral ecologist in particular. So you have this sort of extraordinary mix of both personal experiences and disciplinary trainings, if you like, that all somehow come together and have always been at the root of everything I do as a scientist.
So that is wonderful because it's really a subtext. It really helps us understand the background to this book with its various deep branches. I didn't know about the philosophical background. So you were exposed to both what you call the more shamanic and the doctrinal religions.
Yes.
Do you hold any particular memories of something which might have been fascinating to you as a child or growing up from both of these contexts, both from the tribal shamanic and the doctrinal religions?
I'd hesitate to say there was anything in particular. I think the trouble is if you're brought up in any kind of cultural tradition from a very early age, you just accept that that's how the world is. You don't have a kind of experience. Of course, that's the great observation of whichever Jesuit it was that said, give me a child to the age of 7 and I'll give you a Catholic for life. Well, he didn't actually say that, but that's what he meant. It's that deep, if you like, indoctrination that you get when you're brought up in any kind of culture from a very, very early age. You just take it as it is. But I suppose the answer is when that happens, inevitably you're deeply steeped in religion and are religious in the sense that you perceive yourself to be adhering to one religion or another. But I think it also eventually came to the point of causing me to wonder why these religions were so difficult, what their history was like, and why they differ so much amongst each other, as it were, and therefore what their function really is in terms of both the individual and the community, which is really at the heart of the book, I guess.
Yeah. But as well as growing up bilingual, you had the exposure to these two very different religious cultures. And then, as you were saying, you went to do your undergraduate in psychology and philosophy, and you moved into a different domain, so into zoology, primatology, and you went back to Africa to do your PhD fieldwork with primates. And I mean, just still in the form of introduction, can you tell us about that work? Because from what I understand, this is what eventually gave rise to your intuition, to your insight, that would then lead you throughout most of your career to develop the social brain theory.
Yes, I guess that is true, actually. I mean, I got seduced by the pleasures and pains of fieldwork, because it is I always think of fieldwork on animals as a kind of form of purgatory. You have to go there first before you get to heaven. And heaven for me is trying to understand it and writing about it. So writing papers, writing books to try and explain what's going on there in the world, as it were. But to be able to do that, you have to collect a lot of data, and you have to basically immerse yourself in the life of the organism. This is just going back to old-fashioned ethology of the classical ethologists of the 1940s and 1950s, and who argued very robustly that there is no way you can understand what animals are doing unless you literally live with them, in effect, in the way an anthropologist might do. So that you learn, well, you allow the animals to tell you what's interesting about their lives, instead of imposing your, armchair theories on what they do. And secondly, you have to see the world through their eyes. You have to have so much experience of their daily lives, as it were, and to be able to see it from their point of view and see what's important for them. And I kind of think that my early cultural exposure, multicultural exposure, really proved to be very valuable, because I can literally move from one East African and stroke Indian culture to another simply by changing mental hats without even thinking about it, right? And I think that having learnt to be able to do that became invaluable in terms of understanding the behavior of animals when I eventually came to study them in my early 20s, I guess. But this all came about as an accident of going on a university expedition. It was very popular in those days to go on long expeditions to difficult and remote places during the summer vacations, and the university had a very well-developed exploration club that did that, and we had originally planned to drive across the Sahara, but that kind of fell through, and so we took the easy way and flew, but having arranged in the meantime to do a study of baboons in Ethiopia, because none of us had ever been to Ethiopia, and those of us involved in this expedition, and we thought it would be an interesting place to go. Nothing to do with what you're doing. Studying baboons is just the excuse for going there, getting the money for the costs. But 3 months spent following baboons around in the wild really grabbed me, and so I went on and did a PhD on the same thing, different species of baboons, but in Ethiopia again, and then that branched out into working on colobus monkeys and various antelope, or ungulates anyway, antelope and some caprids, goat family ungulates. And so my first 25 years of research life was deeply immersed in animal behavior, primates and ungulates in the old world anyway, and had no humans in it at all. But out of that experience of just sitting for hours watching what these animals do, it became, particularly the primates, apparent to me that really the central issue for them was deeply social. It's how they maintain the coherence of their social groups through time. And this is not something that people had much focused on. I mean, I come out of a tradition which predated, if you like, behavioral ecology as we now have it, sociobiology, was much more group oriented in its approach to sort of classic socioecology, which is why do you get certain kinds of social systems and certain kinds of ecologies, which didn't really look at the behavior of individuals. But when the sociobiology revolution came about, the selfish gene revolution, I naturally switched into that because we all did. It was so obviously right. but unlike a lot of people, perhaps I've never lost sight of the fact that animals live in communities or live in groups, as of course do humans. So I've always had, while studying the behavior of individual animals, if you like, always had this question, well, what function does the group serve for them? Why do they live in groups? And how do they engineer? Groups don't appear by magic. They have to engineer them in some way, in a behavioral sense and a cognitive sense, of course. And so those questions have always remained dominant from my point of view. And I guess that is why when we started to get interested in humans, which was the second half of my research career, it naturally led me to ask questions about what are the mechanisms that humans use to bond these huge groups that they live in, given that monkeys and apes use social grooming, haptic touch, soft touch as it's sometimes called, which is a much more intimate kind of activity. And somehow we clearly we do use soft touch a great deal, but it's only with our more intimate relationships. But yet somehow we managed to create reasonably cohesive, not always terribly cohesive, but reasonably cohesive social communities. And we must be using some other processes or mechanisms or behaviors to achieve that. And so religion then crept into that mix, because that background experience of the role of religion and just observation really in how religion affects people, observing how it affects people, became kind of obvious to me that religion was an important part of that mix of social bonding mechanisms that humans had somehow evolved or latched onto, discovered at some point.
Yeah, and that takes me to a different question. Halfway through the first chapter of the book, you write, beneath the surface veneer of doctrinal rectitude lurks an ancient foundation of pagan mystical religion. This is the core message of this book. So it's true that a big part of the book reflects that, but there is a tone of provocation in this statement. So it left me wondering if you were thinking of a certain group of people when you wrote this. Were you thinking of theologians, churchgoers?
No, I mean, I suppose actually if I was thinking of anybody, I was thinking of the kind of cognitive science of religion community and the evolutionary psychologists and anthropologists who've busied themselves with an interest in religion and the evolution of religion, because it seemed to me that they had often focused on aspects of individual behavior, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, but in the context of particular beliefs. So it was the title, Cognitive Science of Religion, if you like, sums it up well. The focus is on the kind of mental, psychological mechanisms that predispose us to believe in gods of some kind, or engage with, what would you call it, the theology, if you like. But it just struck me from a lifetime's, at one end, early on, direct experience of this, and then later just observation, that this is not why most humans joined a religion, or believed in a religion, that there was something much more emotional to that and experiential. They had experienced it's obvious in the case of conversion, they had experienced something which had triggered this flood of emotional stuff that led them to commit themselves to the particular religion that happened to be the one that was there on the day. And that all this fancy theology, interesting that it actually is in and of itself, probably didn't play very much of a role. That you could almost put put somebody into a naive person into any religious context, and you would produce a believer. Back to the Jesuits again, right? So my sense was at the back of this book really was actually, if you look at all the big world religions, you see a kind of current of underground current of mysticism and trance-based kind of experiences which have nothing to do with the theology of the religion. They are, in the classic sense of all the mystical elements of all the great world religions, they are your direct experience with the mind of God, is how they would describe describe it. You know, there you are. You slip over that borderland into trance, and you know, you have this sense and experience of engaging directly with another mind. You know, and that sense, that not only is that sense universal to all the great world religions, but it's also there in various forms, right the way down to the hunter-gatherer, more animist type religions, you know, because they are all based on trance states, engineered in some way, sometimes chemically, sometimes physically through, you know, sort of dancing or singing or what have you. But it's all there, and the message of the book in some sense is, you know, people are religious because of these emotional things, and that emotional thing is strongly associated with trance states, and trance states are a universal feature of all religions. And if you like, they are the cause of many of the problems that the world religions have, because these trance state type things, these emotional things, are what triggers the budding off of small sects and cults that have, since they were founded, all of them have bedeviled the hierarchies of all the world religions, because, you know, if you let these sects and cults get away from you, as it were, and don't control them, you know, they partly because it's very emotional and very deeply binding in that sense, but also very often their theologies, shall we put it politely, a bit heretical usually. It's apt to, you know, create novel religions budding off, large-scale religions budding off. That's exactly what's happened in all the world religions. You know, the emergence of Christianity out of Judaism, and Islam out of the mix of Judaism and Christianity in the Arabian Peninsula. The same going on within Judaism, the same thing happening within Buddhism, the same thing happening within you know, any Hinduism, you name it. All the big world religions, unless they were founded very, very recently, you know, have been bedeviled by this constant history of sort of sects and cults bubbling up from underneath. And they're bubbling up from underneath because they're about these ancestral, deeply ancestral conditions in which religion first appeared and evolved, and capitalizing on these deeply emotional experiences that you can have.
What you're saying makes lots of sense. I mean, comparing your book, and I will not name any names, but comparing it with many other books by people who write on the cognitive science of religion, your book has two things which you usually don't find in those books. First, there is a very clear and alive sense of lived religion, while sometimes you finish those books and you end up thinking, what kind of religion are they thinking about? I mean, have they actually ever seen it happening in front of them? And with your book, that doesn't happen at all. But something else, which is very clear in your book, which is rarely approached by cognitive science of religion, is that you have a very clear, you present here a very clear landscape of structural changes in this transition from being hunter-gatherers to settlers who rely on farming and cattle, and how this stimulates this change from shamanic to doctrinal religions. But then you say something which is very counterintuitive. You say that the widespread notion that agriculture provides better nutrition for less effort is wrong, which goes against everything that we have learned in school, right? And you say that the reason why we had to build settlements was not because agriculture was an easier form of life, but because larger settlements provided a better protection against riders who wanted to kill and take away your food, and young women. This is put in such a clear, visceral way. Then you go on to suggest that living in large settlements bring with it a whole set of new challenges, because it's very stressful to manage all of these people living in a small space. And as a side note, this reminded me of Bruce Chatwin, the travel writer, who had his own theory and produced a kind of pseudo PhD thesis about how humans were meant to be nomadic creatures, and the fact that we stopped being nomads has left us unhappy and urging for travel. So let me break this into two different questions. I mean, first, can you tell us about the major changes in what you call the crisis in the Neolithic? And then can you tell us about the implications in this change from hunter-gathering to agricultural societies in terms of religious experience and beliefs?
Yeah, okay. So this is actually, in terms of my intellectual development, if you like, this whole idea is really quite a recent discovery, you might say, in that although it's been hovering at the back of my mind for a very long time, since I was studying primates in particular, it's only within the last perhaps 5 years or so that I've realized just how stressful group living actually is for mammals. And so we've shown with mammals in general, but this is also the case for humans, that the bigger the group you live in, the less fertile the females are. This is a generic effect that you find right the way across mammals, from the humblest voles and shrews at one end to the most sophisticated primates at the other end. And this is a particular problem for primates because they evolved this kind of bonded sociality. So the way the bulk of mammals cope with this problem, basically it sets an upper limit on the number of females you can have living together at about 5, something like that, 5, maybe 7 at a push. If you have more females than that, their fertility drops below the replacement rate, and they're not producing babies fast enough to compensate for the natural deaths in the group. So the group goes extinct. Now, most mammals cope with it either by living in small bonded groups of maybe 15 animals at the most. So they've, lions, people, species like that, many of the canids, the dog family, wolves, and so on. They tend to keep numbers down. If the number gets above that, some animals bud off and form a new group. Or they adopt the kind of antelope and deer strategy, which is a fission fusion social system where groups have no stability in time, let's say, and individuals come and go and join and leave groups as suits their convenience and the costs and benefits of doing so. But what primates have done is decided at some point in their early history to live in stable social groups, bonded social groups, where the groups maintain coherence through time. They're very stable in terms of membership, because the group is sort of bound together by these deep bonded relationships between individuals, like a form of gravitation, as I started to call it, really. It's like a gravitational field which just holds everybody locked in place. But the problem with that is it leaves you exposed to this stresses effect that mammals, we inherit from our mammal ancestors. And so the question is, how do they get around that? And the answer is they've developed coalitions which allow particularly the females to buffer themselves against the stresses imposed by other members of the group living in close proximity to other people. And, you know, essentially that's a kind of best friend forever type solution, if you like, which we see in humans. You know, that's what women tend to do. They have their romantic partner, and they also have a best friend forever, who's usually another female, not always, but usually. So these kind of buffering relationships become very important. Now, the problem is, this is fine, but these processes only work up to a point. That point seems to be group size of about 50, judging by primates. And it turns out that that's the standard size for human hunter-gatherer living groups. They tend not to live in bigger groups. If they do, you see increasing evidence of structural breakdown, most conspicuously evidenced by the fact that homicide rates just go through the roof. So the problem is, if for some reason you decide to live in bigger groups, which is what seems to have happened during the early Neolithic, after the end of the last ice age, that's when we started to live in permanent villages. Once these villages get above maybe 100, 150 people in size, you've got a serious problem. So not to put too fine a point on it, how do you allow how did the development of large villages and towns eventually, and then cities and city-states and so on through those early years come about in the face of these extraordinary stresses? Because they're not just the fertility problem, but there's also the females experience. There's also this problem of male violence that spills over and becomes very destructive. So essentially the problem they were facing is, how do they live in big villages without killing each other? Now, you know, hunter-gatherers already have religion. Religion is clearly very old in the human lineage, but it's this kind of animistic, trance-based, shamanic form. It's very experiential, as I sometimes describe it. As say, everybody takes part, everybody engages in it, everybody goes into trance and into spirit travels and in the spirit world, as it were, all these kind of things. But this is very good for bonding small groups, which is why they keep reproducing cults and sects at the bottom of the big religions. But it doesn't really work for holding very large numbers of people together. And my suggestion is that that's why doctrinal religions occur for the first time at that point. Now, that view is a very old view. It's been around in the history of religions for well over 100, 150 years even, that religion evolved in these two major phases. This early, as they called it, animist form, you know, I tend to call it a shamanistic type form of religion. And then at some point, this switched over into these doctrinal religions. And by doctrinal, we mean, you know, they have doctrines, theologies in a meaningful sense. They have moral codes, which are justified not by common experience, which is what happens in the hunter-gatherers. You know, they have moral codes, but if you ask them, well, where did your moral code come from? Well, that's how we've always done it. It's just what it is to be a member of our tribe. Whereas in once you get in the doctrinal phase, you start to have these moral codes justified by appeal to some greater force, i.e. a god in some form. And also then, you know, there are rituals to be performed to pacify the gods, sacrifices to be made, all these kind of things. And so you have professional priesthoods, you have special religious spaces, temples, whatever you want to call them, and so on and so forth. And so, you know, we've known from the archaeology that the signals for these things all appear fairly early on during the Neolithic, after the development of villages, so probably around 7,000 years ago, something of that order. But what's interesting about this is there appears to be a second phase of this process that occurred sometime around 3,000 years ago, running through to about 500 AD, I guess, so over a 1500-year period. This again has been known about and commented on for a long time. This is what's called the Axial Age, and in the Axial Age, it's characterized by the appearance of these very large-scale world religions as we have them now. So the early doctrinal religions were tended to have many gods, each associated with some different hill or valley or spring or some function or purpose. You know, the god of war, the god of fertility, the god of the harvest, and all these kind of different kinds of gods. And to be a bit chaotic in that sense and unspecific, whereas, you know, what seems to happen with the rise of the Axial Age religions is everything gets focused on a single supreme god, if you like. They become monotheistic. They're all monotheistic religions in some form, even those that look as though they're not, like Hinduism. There's still a sort of top god, if you like, running the whole show. And that seems to have been associated with the collapse, a massive amount of social and political and economic collapse that happened at around that time as a result of climate change. I mean, major changes in climate that occurred around 4,000 years ago onwards, which resulted in the drying up of the Sahara to the point where it, you know, is now, as it is, a desert. So you had this transition from what had been a really rich environment, masses of big lakes and huge rivers, lots of animals around, and good growing conditions, allowing populations to explode, if you like, after the end of the last ice age in that particular area, and then hitting this or running full tilt into the buffers created by the collapse in the climate, which resulted in massive migrations all around, not only the Mediterranean, but right across the Ganges plain and in India and into China. And it's in that belt, which these northern subtropical zone, that all these Axial Age religions arose. Now, once I kind of put all these bits and pieces of the jigsaw together, it dawned on me that you're dealing here with exactly what you see in the course of primate social evolution, indeed in other aspects of human social evolution, is a series of glass ceilings. You've got a problem, you solve the problem with some sticking plaster, if you like. The sticking plaster works for so long, but as the population gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it ceases to work. So you hit another glass ceiling, and you can only break through that glass ceiling if you can find another sticking plaster to that secondary problem, as it were. So, and that trajectory is purely a demographic trajectory. It's to do with the size of the groups that you need to live in. And so going back to the beginning of the story, if you like, in terms of the rise of agriculture and so on, the reason why agriculture evolved, I suggest, controversially somewhat, is not in order to provide us with an easy life, because we've known, the archaeologists have known for a long time that isn't true. Nutritional stress in the early farmers is something to behold. It's extraordinary. They went from being very robust and healthy people as hunter-gatherers to having a very, very hard life as agriculturalists. So rather than the Neolithic Revolution being about the invention of agriculture and living in villages becoming necessary to provide a workforce for agriculture, it's quite the opposite way around. They had to develop agriculture in order to allow them to live in villages, because living in villages restricts greatly your access to wild resources in the immediate vicinity. You very quickly exhaust the area around you and have to go further and further afield. Well, that exposes you again to the very problem that you were trying to avoid by living in a group. And that seems to have been raiding by other people. Now, that's not my idea. That idea came from a couple of very eminent historical sociologists who suggested it some 30 years ago, that the development of settlements and cities and city-states was as a defense against raiding by others. And it turns out the genetic evidence now tells us that in that northern subtropical zone running across the top of Africa and through the Mediterranean and the Near East, right the way, in particular, the population growth from about 15,000 years ago was absolutely phenomenal. So when the Ice Age receded, you had this incredibly rich habitat, and clearly the genetics tells us, there's no question about it, but the archaeology had also hinted at it. The populations just absolutely exploded, and the equivalent evidence from equatorial Africa in West Africa in forests, or from hunter-gatherers in southern Africa, shows absolutely no such trend at all until much, much, much later. So it looks like the folks that happened to be up there were living in a near perfect environment, produced large numbers of surviving offspring, and then hit the buffers because there were basically too many of them. And on top of that, a lot of people round about found it much easier to go and rob their food off somebody else than actually having to find it for themselves. You know, humans are very lazy, I'm afraid. And it's that caused this need to live in villages for protection and triggered the switch into doctrinal type religions. Yeah. But it's a kind of interesting, I mean, I think the evidence for it is you know, irrefutable, frankly, when you look at it. It's just that we were kind of not thinking along those lines. And I guess it's because most of the people who dealt with those kind of issues, like archaeologists and the like, they're not demographers, they're not ecologists. Yeah. And they don't see the problems that any animal has from any species when they're faced with these kinds of demographic constraints, as it were, on what they can do. So it's a very convoluted story, but I think it hangs together very, very well. It explains a lot.
And although we don't mention this explicitly, it was on the back of my mind when I was reading that chapter, where you also mentioned rock art painting. Something that has happened is that there is a clear evolution. In those first images, there's practically animals. You very rarely see human figures, which of course is very in sync with the shamanic worldview, which is much less hierarchical, in which humankind is at the same level. When you move into a different level, the agricultural and the religions associated with it, not only have these gods and monotheism, but you have a much more anthropocentric idea, which you don't have before.
Yes. No, but you have to remember the key giveaway here is rock art, because it was all deep in caves, right? And you know, caves almost certainly were very important for living in as safe refuges, but also warm, because the temperature is kept up much better inside a cave than outside a cave, even when it's not an ice age. And you know, my sense is that as they started to explore the depths of some of these cave systems, you know, what they were experiencing was the kind of disorientation that you get in the course of trance, that it actually probably was responsible for triggering a lot of that kind of stuff. So this is very much a view. Well, it has been suggested by other people, and a lot of this rock art is not hunting. Well, it's not hunting pictures. Here we are, chaps, because often there are stick people hovering around the edges of these herds of animals, and occasionally firing the odd arrow towards them. That these are actually almost, well, I kind of wondered whether they were kind of guidebooks to the experiences you would be having when you went in to do these rituals deep inside these caves. So here's the guidebook for you. Just, you know, expect to see these kinds of things. But of course, religion is also partly about controlling the world. And a standard feature all the way through all religions is, managing the bad bits that the world insists on throwing at you: illness, infertility, shortage of food, attacks by outsiders. All these kind of things are the things that people, if you like, pray about, even in the world religions, as we have them now, at least the first two anyway. The magical kind of experience you have in the dark, or the flickering light deep inside some of these cave systems, I suspect really probably triggered and focused and triggered these kind of trance-like experiences, which of course you can have outside, around campfires too. And I hasten to add, they're nearly always done at night. Almost all these rituals are done at night. So they're done in the dark because that heightens the kind of psychedelic experience of it and helps to trigger in the trance states.
And you do mention in your book that that work by Aldous Huxley, Heaven and Hell, where he goes on and on about the effect of lights in the night when there are no other lights around.
Yes. Yes, well, these guys played a lot. Once they discovered mescaline and things, over in America, were introduced to them. It got them all very excited and gave rise to the hippie era culture of the 60s and the psychedelic fun times that people allegedly had, because if you were there, you're not supposed to remember it. So I deny remembering it.
Let me go back to the bulk of social brain theory. I couldn't help thinking of when you're giving popular science talks, and I'm sure you give a lot of them. How often do you get the question, Professor Dunbar, if your social brain theory is correct about the ideal size of a human network and community, then our large industrial-based societies would be classified as deeply stressful and unhealthy. Is that what you really think?
The answer is they are, aren't they? They're awful. You only have to look at the history of most big cities, for example, London, the classic one, through the 18th and 19th century. There's people were brought in, attracted into them for jobs and so on, and lived in the most appalling conditions of poverty and ill health, until the Victorians managed to sort out things like sewage systems and the like. Sort of these cities have never been terribly healthy places to live in, but people are attracted into them because they provide more opportunities, better opportunities for employment. But often the cost is very, very high. I mean, the mortality rate in the kind of poor areas, say London, the East End of London, through the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, was absolutely frightening. It virtually only maintained its population because people kept coming, new people kept coming to replace the high levels of mortality. But I'm now got lost as to where we're going, so we're going to take a blip out for Anthony, cut that bit out, and we can start again when you remind me what the question was.
I was just mimicking the idea of someone asking you at the end of these talks, do you really think that our societies, given its size, are deeply unhealthy? And I know that more recently you also wrote about the problem of social isolation due to the pandemic. So so it's something which is also concerning you. Yeah.
Oh, yes. I think you have to kind of appreciate that big cities in the end are not nirvana. They may be a stepping stone to somewhere else, but the process of getting to somewhere else was often extremely painful and costly for individuals to do. which is another good reason in those contexts for having a religion to rely on to make the world seem better than it is. One of the classic explanations as to why we have religion. But at the same time, I think this simply goes back to the story as I told it of the Neolithic and the rise of settlements and so on, that all the way through human history, there have been these constraints on the size of groups you can live in. And this is as much true of our primate cousins as it is for humans. What humans have been able to do is, when they wanted to, they don't have to do it, but when they wanted to for good ecological or economic reasons, live in larger groups, they've often been able to find solutions for doing so. Sometimes those have been secular, the creation of laws and judges and police forces to make you behave. But at the same time, the doctrinal religions in particular seem to have played an important role in this, both because the rituals allow you to bond with the other members of the community, even if you don't know who they are, and therefore behave better towards them, but also secondarily, there's the famous policeman in the sky argument that, you may think, Miguel, that we can't see what you're up to behind the bicycle sheds on Saturday night. And indeed, we don't see what you're up to behind the bicycle sheds on Saturday night, but there is somebody who can. And you will in due course be punished for your misbehaviors appropriately. And so that sense of a policeman in the sky, as it's come to be known, it plays an important role in keeping us on the page, really, and not being too disruptive or destructive of the trust and bonding that allows us to hold these groups together. But in there, you have the seeds of creating very, very large groups. And I think religions have been particularly successful at doing that. And that's reflected in the rise of the axial age religions, because they seem to emerge once you have a polity, let's say an extended political community, a state, if you like, of about 1 million people. That's what most of the estimates seem to suggest now. So they arise when you've got very large numbers of people to try and hold together, and particularly so in their case, under conditions which were extremely stressful for them, because the world was effectively falling apart. So all of these are just sort of us using our smart brains to find ways to solve these constraints in order to be able to live in progressively bigger groups. The interesting question is, can we keep going like this forever? Can we have all 8 billion people alive today, all living in one sort of one small space somewhere in the world? Or is that, is it only working at the moment because they're reasonably dispersed? And our actual groups clumped together in any one space are only 10 or 15 million people in any given context, as it were. So I don't know. We will find out, no doubt, in if we live long enough, whether this is going to work or not, and if human ingenuity can find a solution to that. It might be, sort of the development, because these are not. I mean, I speak of these in evolutionary terms, but at this point we're talking about historical development, historical evolution, human ingenuity, finding solutions to the problem. So, what may arise out of the ashes of the next few centuries, if we don't get a grip on our population explosion that's better than it currently is, out of that, the ashes of that may arise, yet new religions, even more sophisticated religions. Who knows?
Robin, you have moved from thinking about becoming a philosopher to being a primatologist, and then you have spent quite a lot of time being a kind of experimental psychologist. And one chunk of the book has to do with experiments that you've been conducting. Now, you have here quite colorful set of experiments. You have a Hindu Swami who is teaching workshops on yoga with or without spiritual component. You're giving a drug which inhibits endorphins to participants of an Afro-Brazilian ritual in São Paulo. I'm not even going to ask how that happened and if you smuggle the drugs from the UK to Brazil. You're experimenting with atheists who take part in a secular ritual, the Sunday Assembly. So, I mean, very interesting stuff. Most experimental psychologists don't get to do such interesting things.
Yeah, you might think of these as field experiments, might
Yes.
you not?
Yeah.
Rather than conventional experiments in the lab, although some of those were done in the lab. But I guess you have to remember that I'm not so much of a traditional lab-based experimental psychologist. I served my time, as you might say, at least as an undergraduate, learning how to do those kinds of things. But my subsequent experience working on wild animals kind of reminded me all the way along, I think, that the really useful experiments are those done in the natural world. Now, they're subject to all sorts of constraints and difficulties, and particularly difficulties of inference, because there's invariably lots of confounds there. And that's why we do experiments, is to try and hold all those confounds constant. But my natural instinct is to either collect observational data, quantitative observational data, or to do experiments in natural environments, or I suppose another form of quantitative observational data would be survey type data. So one of the projects I did myself was a big, large-scale survey of people's reactions, if you like, to their degree of religious engagement. So what were the consequences in terms of their feelings of bondedness to members of the community and their happiness and their health and so on as a result of attending religious activities with lesser or greater frequencies. So that was, and I thought, that gelled very nicely with some of the earlier work we'd done on the general processes of social bonding in the secular context, if you like, which is where all this started out. Just how do we bond our communities? How do we create our friendships? And this really looked at, in the end, a variety of about 6 different major tools in our social toolkit whereby we do this. So these are things like laughter, singing, dancing, feasting together, storytelling, and the rituals of religion. And for all the others outside religion, we had run a series of experiments, both in the lab and, if you like, in the wild, looking at the effect of doing these activities on the degree of bonding, and trying to look at the mechanism, the physiological mechanism involved in that, which we'd come to the view was the endorphin system in the brain, which seems to be what underpins trance states. The brain is flooded with this stuff. And doing that both by experimental designs of various kinds, but also trying to converse experiments where we would use either chemical or neuroimaging mechanisms for either blocking off the endorphin system, so we could show that you didn't get these experiences when the system was blocked, which is what you've alluded to in the case of some of the studies that you and I did. I will let the cat out of the bag. Mainly you, I think, in these religious contexts. And also running large-scale, very expensive neuroimaging experiments through other people, through other collaborators elsewhere. And I simply, sort of had this standard kind of experimental design, which we ran in all these different contexts. And that was the one that was used for the rituals of religion studies, which were done, and there were the ones done, as you remember, in actual church services, mostly Christian church services, that were done in Brazil and on Umbanda, syncretic Afro-Caribbean type religious contexts, and even done in the lab with secular and religious yoga.
Weren't you surprised by the results, in the sense that wouldn't you expect larger differences between attending a religious versus a secular ritual?
Yes. Well, that was, I think, the interesting question that was hovering behind those religious experiments or experiments in religious contexts, was whether belief in the religion in question heightened the effect. I think what the evidence does actually say is that it does. It's not maybe massively overwhelming. You still get an effect, even if you don't, it's done in a completely secular form, as indeed was the case with both the yoga studies experiment that was done with a secular form of explanation for the effect of the yoga practice, and also in the Sunday assembly, which has a sort of atheological, spiritual form of humanistic religion, if you like, doesn't believe in the kinds of things that religions promote and rest their whole way of being on, that you got these bonding effects, and it makes people feel good. But I think there was a sense in which the ones that were doing it as regular attendees at a church, and spectacularly so, I think, with the Brazilian ones, with the Umbanda ones, a much, much stronger effect. Now, this is not a surprise, I think, because we have shown that all the way through all our other experiments, that if you just do a physical exercise, you get an endorphin effect. If you do it in synchrony, it ramps it up. And therefore, if you add on, and of course, most religious services are highly synchronized. We all get up and sing a hymn together in perfect time. We allow the choir perhaps to do some fancy stuff over the top of us, but for the rest of the congregation, it's usually singing in synchrony, in unison. We all kneel down or stand up or abase ourselves, as the case may be, simultaneously at the same time. We all sit back to listen to a sermon or whatever it may be. So there's a lot of synchrony going on in these things. But then I think if you add on top of that an explanation as to why this works and why this is important, it's no surprise to me that you should have an even bigger effect. And there is a nice experiment that was done showing such an effect. This was done by other people, that groups that were performing a more organized religious function, as it were, got a much stronger effect, a feeling of bonding out of the belief that the activity was for this or associated with this religious function, whereas those that were doing more secular ones didn't. And I think this goes back to the observation that Rich Sosis and I made with the data on the 19th century American utopian communes and foundations. So think of the Shakers and the Mormons and various other kinds of secular foundations of the New Harmony community, for example, that what we showed there was the religious foundations. So those foundations, those utopian foundations going off into the desert to get away from the wickedness of society on the east coast of America, mostly, which had a religious philosophy to them, had a much larger size at foundation. They could get more people packed in and behaving themselves, and lasted much longer. In fact, 7 times as long as foundations which were purely secular, because what tended to happen was the secular foundations only lasted about 10 years, sometimes a lot less, usually because the chief guru or founder ran off with the foundation's money or the wives of everybody else, one of the two. Whereas the religious foundations just allowed people to be much more committed to the project and to each other, and so they had a much longer. The difference was very stark in terms of how long they survived. As I said, that the average age duration for secular foundations was only about 10 years. It was 70 years for religious foundations. And I think there's something about the religious context, as it were, if you like the theology, that explains why we should be doing this stuff and what the consequences are, that enhance these bonding components and just make them work better.
Yeah. Robin, we've been talking for about 1 hour. So I'm thinking of a final question. Let's imagine that you were having a dinner date with a couple of mystics, well, can be Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross, and you were telling them about your theory of how religion stimulates endorphin release, how this makes people feel good. So you give some examples of painful rituals, but let's think of contemplative meditative practices that they describe. I think that Saint John of the Cross, for example, would perfectly agree that doing some of these practices does produce a whole range of psychophysical pleasant sensations. And I mean, and thinking of St. John of the Cross, even his description of the dark night of the soul testifies to that, in the sense that it's that time where you feel it, where there is a period of dryness. So you feel abandoned by God because you're not getting the usual psychophysical endorphin kick. Yeah. So there seems to be an acknowledgement that these religious practices do something to the body. And I mean, that you can find also examples like that across the Hindu and Buddhist tradition. But I mean, because you have seen and read about this, you also know that the aim of these practices is to move then beyond the body and the world. So have you given some thought to this, and what social brain theory leaves out when explaining religious experience at that level?
The answer is yes, although I probably don't discuss it as much as in the book as I might have done, actually. But the issue really in the end, I mean, I think if you read any of the classic writings by all the great mystics in Christianity, particularly the medieval and early modern mystics within Catholicism, well, even the later ones, Teresa of Lisieux and people like that, much later on into the 19th century. You have this sense. I mean, I really don't think any of them would be at all fazed by most of the things I say about this part, at the very least. But what's also interesting, I think, is that it bears on the issue of why we should get so many different kinds of religions. In other words, there's an exact parallel to this in the issue of the evolution of language. Why, if this facility, religion or language, which is meant to create a bonded, well-functioning society, or transfer information from one person to another within a community so that things get done and so on, you would think we would all end up with one religion and one language, right? And we don't. Well, 8,000 languages, most of which are mutually incomprehensible in the world today, and that, you know, doesn't count the ones that have already gone extinct. There's probably the same number of religions. So the question then is why that should be the case. And I think that's simply a consequence of the fact that humans are eternally curious. They spend a lot of time thinking when they don't have to be grubbing for food in the forest or in their fields, when they can afford to spend time thinking about why the world works the way it is and about these experiences they have, start to develop explanations. They're very good for creating explanations, because explanations just in terms of everyday efficiency are important for allowing us to organize knowledge about the world in a efficient kind of way. So this is the mental models approach in cognitive psychology, I guess. And you know, that inevitably, you know, if you and I, having never met, sat down and in some obscure place and had the same trance experiences, we would come probably up with different theories as to what was going on. So I think that's all that's happening there. It's interesting that they all kind of hover around the same kinds of ideas. There's obviously some generic theme being built in there across all these great religions, the great modern religions anyway. But that's kind of another story. I think that it's not surprising that you should, and of course this was the big problem for the better part of 2,000 years for the Catholic Church in particular, but everybody else seems to have had the same problem, is they were constantly battling against novel sects being pitched up largely by mystical experiences, you know, and you know, they were forever having this problem with all the religious orders. Almost all of them at one time or another, the monastic orders, I mean, got hauled up before the Inquisition for having heretical views, not least Francis of Assisi, who I think got hauled up twice because of you know, sort of doubts about the properness of some of his ideas. And in some senses, I suppose the religious orders of the Catholic Church are an interesting example of how you manage these cults and sects bubbling up with quite radical ideas in many cases as a result of particular experiences that individuals as founders setting them up had. And somehow the Catholic Church has been quite good at kind of managing them and trying to keep them within the fold. Occasionally they escaped, and you know, somebody went and nailed some protestations to the door of some cathedrals, created rather bigger problems that weren't easily resolved. But you know, by and large, you know, you have to be impressed with that. Although I hasten to say, you know, most of the first 400 years probably of Christianity after the death of Christ consisted of one council after another being called for to declare some upstart cult somewhere as heretical and to be banished and never spoken of again. So they clearly had a lot of trouble. And I think that was simply because, you know, in those days, and we're talking about the first 4 centuries AD, when communication and travel was not that easy, you know, but the religion had spread right the way through the Roman Empire, that, you know, you've got people at one end in the Levant and Asia Minor, developing theology, if you like, and you've got a bunch of other people in the deserts of the Nile Valley and the Sahara, and even further afield over towards the western side, far away, and they knew nothing of what you were doing in the Levant or in Rome, for that matter. So there's much more opportunity then for kind of wayward ideas to come forward. So I think that was why they had so much trouble, and they were constantly having to call the bishops together councils to try and just arbitrate really on the rectitude of these more obscure things. But even after that, I mean, the medieval period, sort of 1000 AD through to about 1500, and the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, there were so many bizarre sects and cults. I mean, more people claim to being Jesus Christ personified in that period than I think has ever done since. And even worse, a lot of them went ahead and married the Virgin Mary, who turned out usually to be one of their female helpers, or in one famous case, a statue, because allegedly the young lady concerned was too busy in heaven to attend her matrimonial engagement in the fields outside Paris. It's just and it's just you can understand how the bishops in Rome must have been tearing their hair out.
Professor Robin Dunbar, thank you so much for your wonderful storytelling and for this book.
Great pleasure.